Welcome everyone to today's devotion. We find ourselves starting a brand new book of the New Testament. We just finished Ephesians yesterday, and so if you're in Ephesians 6 where we left off, turn to the next page, and that's where we are right now in the book of Philippians. Philippians is only 4 chapters long, which means next Tuesday we'll conclude. Again, much of the New Testament is quite small. After you get through 2 Corinthians, most of the books are significantly small outside of maybe Hebrews and Revelation. So Philippians, you could read it quite quickly in one setting, and it wouldn't take you long at all. The thing you need to know about Philippians is the context by which it is written. It has a similar context of Ephesians, in that Paul is in prison. There's some debate as to which imprisonment it is, and that's fine. But he is in prison. Now, I want you to pause and think about what is it that you would write if you were writing from prison. We saw in Ephesians, Paul's main message, it was that of unity driven by the gospel. And that's a strange message in of itself, considering the context. If we were in prison, we would write about injustice and the system and starting a revolution, right? We would write about that sort of stuff. Paul doesn't. Paul doesn't defend himself while he's in prison for the most part. He rather speaks to the needs of the believers he is writing to. In the book of Philippians, he writes about unity. Unity is a big issue in Philippians, but the main issue in Philippians is joy. He writes about joy. He wants the Philippians to know and to grow in the joy of God. Now, just that alone, I think, is just worth meditating on. Would you or I, if we were unjustly incarcerated, be concerned about the issue of joy? Paul writes over and over again to rejoice and to have joy, and at times it's a bit over the top. And so you really can't get through any part of this letter without seeing the role that joy plays in the Christian life. It's one of the reasons why Philippians is one of my favorite letters of Paul. Notice he begins after his typical greetings in the first 2 verses. He starts in verse 3 and 4, speaking of prayer. One could say that verse 3 is the thesis of the chapter. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. And so he begins with the issue of thanksgiving. I actually think that's a helpful way of looking at this first chapter. That a thankful heart comes out of a joyful heart. Right? And I would say the more thankful you are, the more joyful you'll become. Right? One feeds into the other. And if you really think about that, that's common sense that we miss all the time. We often think that if I justify myself, if I blame other people, if I criticize them, that'll make me feel better about myself. And it may make you feel better about yourself for a time, but it doesn't give you real lasting joy. So remember in Ephesians, he talks about surrendering the self for the sake of the other. Here he's saying be thankful to God for others, and out of that will become joy. So you can choose right now to be angry and malicious towards other people in the bitterness of your heart, or you can choose to be thankful for the gifts of God and the people God has put in your life. You can choose that right now, and one will be the difference between joy and misery. Joy and misery. But he says, I think of you all the time, and one of the ways he thinks of them is through prayer. Notice verse 4, that always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy. And he gives his reason, because of your partnership in the gospel. So you see the connection between thanksgiving and joy, prayer and joy. People you pray for, you're more likely to let go of some of your bitterness and resentment if you're praying for their well-being. And out of that prayer and thanksgiving comes joy. None of this should be surprising, but whenever we see it in the text, hopefully it opens our eyes, because we don't often think about these sort of things. So Paul says, my joy for you, or my joy is in you, that you continue to partner with me in the gospel. So we see the uniting connection here is the gospel. The gospel produces joy. The gospel produces unity. The gospel brings community. Right? And so Paul is thankful for the gospel that has all of these benefits. He goes down to verse 9. It is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent and be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So we see that he is thankful for them, their partnership with the gospel, with him and with others. And out of that, his prayer is that they would grow in love and they would abound in love more and more. And from that comes wisdom, knowledge and all discernment. It's an Old Testament way to speak of wisdom. And that they may prove to be blameless on the day of Christ. So one of the things you'll see is how Paul merges the idea of justification and sanctification. Whereas in Romans, it was a very clear-cut sort of issue. He speaks of justification, then he speaks of sanctification, because they are separate. At the same time, you can't separate them. Both are true. And so Philippians, he deals less with the theological foundation of justification, and he focuses more on sanctification. So having partnered in the gospel, may your love abound more and more, so that you would present yourself holy and blameless. Verse 18, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, what is most important to Paul? Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now the context of verse 18 has to do with Paul dealing with the fact that there were some people preaching the gospel that may not have been connected with Paul or the apostles or the Philippian church. And there were some within the church saying, they're not in our tribe, we should shut them down. And Paul says, look, there are some people who preach and do ministry out of bad motives. But if it's the pure gospel being preached, leave them alone. I'm okay with my poverty and they and their riches. I'm okay in my poor reputation and imprisonment if they are popular and doing well. What matters most is the gospel is being proclaimed. In that simple truth, we rejoice. I'll tell you one of the things I've noticed as we become more of a post-Christian society is that churches struggle with partnering with other churches because we feel like we are competing for the same fish, right? For the same sheep. And so we become bitter if the church down the road seems to be doing well. Their budget has increased, the number of bodies and pews have increased, and we become bitter towards it, rather than saying, I rejoice that God is doing great things there. Let it be he does great things here as well. Paul says what matters most is the gospel. And out of the gospel and the proclamation of the gospel comes joy. And so we're not competitors with other believers. We rejoice with other believers. And that can happen whenever you are thankful for your brothers. Well, then in the rest of, really the rest of chapter 1, he continues this theme of prayer. You see it there, verse 18 says, yes, and I will rejoice. You see, this is the theme throughout the whole book. For verse 19, I know that through my prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ will turn out for my deliverance, right? He's in prison. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. And this is what he's setting up. He says, whether prison kills me or I am set free, my charge doesn't change. I am called to live for Christ. So I want you to think about what is he's going to articulate here. He says his joy is not determined by circumstances, but by Christ. So Paul says, if I am in prison, I have reasons to rejoice. I look around and see God has given me partners in the gospel like you. I have reasons to rejoice. If I am set free from prison, what I find is added opportunities to tell others of Jesus and rejoice in their joy. If God takes me in prison, then I rejoice that I am with him for eternity. You see, your joy is not determined by circumstances. Your happiness might be, right? That's the problem. Our culture speaks of happiness. It is one of the main idols, that we just want to be happy, right? And what matters most is that we are happy. And if it makes you happy, we learn from the great theologian Sheryl Crow, I think Sheryl Crow back in the day, it can't be that bad, right? What matters most is your happiness. The problem becomes, happiness becomes an idol that we're constantly chasing. And we never get what it is that we are looking for, because we're actually looking for joy, a joy that surpasses our circumstances. So whether you're rich or poor, whether your party wins the election or not, or whether you're in quarantine or not, what you can be a person of joy. Doesn't mean that we laugh amid suffering or that we deny the role of mourning and lamentation. What it does say that despite moments of suffering, despite moments of lamentation, we can still possess the joy of God. And so he says, starting in verse 21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh," that means fruitful labor for me, "yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ." Well, I get that. "But that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith." There it is again. It just naturally shows up in the text. Paul says, look, if I leave and I depart, which is really what I want, then my joy is made complete, and that I'm with Jesus. He says, but if I stay, my mission is your joy. Right? That is where my thanksgiving and prayers and joy come from, to see the joy and the work of God in your life. And so he summarizes it, I think, quite well in verse 27. So although I think I think of you and I'm thankful for you, and my prayers was the key idea, I think the real foundation of where Paul is going is in verse 27. "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ." That is a summary, not just of in general of what sanctification is, but of Paul's argument here in Philippians. If your manner of life is worthy of the gospel, the good news is you will possess joy. This is why I think and I believe spiritual health is public health. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. See you guys here tomorrow for Philippians 2.